Hello, everyone. I just want to add a quick note before we get into it. I know that I said in the introduction that this episode would be the Fool and the Magician, but I decided to stick to one card per week because I don't want these episodes to go too long. So we're just going to stick to one card a week unless I feel like there is a week that we can fit two in and make it feasible. So let's jump right into this first episode of Venus and Retrocast. You're listening to Venus and Retrocast, a tarot podcast for the astro-curious. I'm your host, Brandi Spradling. Each week, I explore how to deepen your understanding of the tarot using methods in astrology. Together, we're going to strengthen our relationships with ourselves and each other. So let's get into it and read some tarot, retro style. Hello and welcome to this episode of Venus and Retrocast. It's Brandi and I am so excited to be here and to be kicking this off today. So I just want to start out by expressing some gratitude. Like, this is a dream come true for me, and I'm so blessed every day by all of my followers and my family and friends just, being a part of this journey. This really does feel like a full journey. So I just wanted to name that and name that I'm nervous, and I'm sure that this will get better over time. So if you decide to stick with me after this first episode, I am so grateful. All right, so let's jump into it. So the first card we're going to talk about today is the Fool. And I wanted to start out talking about what the card means so that we kind of have a foundation and we're all on the same page. There are so many ways to read the Fool, but I'm just going to talk about it from my perspective for these purposes. So when the Fool comes up, we're being asked to say yes to ourselves in some way, like to dive into something new and trust that the universe will catch us. So, often there's an inherent level of privilege in this card when you think about it that way. I mean, who's allowed to be foolish in society? Who's allowed to just, say, I'm going to move across the country or across the world and start something fresh, or, start a new program of study and, completely change my life, or change the lives of people around me by, a mission that I go on. Like, there's a lot of privilege in that. There's, class privilege. There's often a lot of able-bodied privilege. There's a lot of white and white passing privilege. A lot of race and class issues go together. And on and on and on. So, that's something that we need to think about with the Fool. And, when we want to think about being more inclusive, a way that we can look at it as not necessarily being an external leap, because we don't all have the privilege of that. And, looking at where we are with the pandemic, especially if you're living in the United States, it's kind of shined a light on, how different a full leap can look when you can't go outside, you can't, be around people, or you have to wear a mask and hope that people will take care of you, as a collective, just those restrictions and limitations that come along with living in a world that you're not used to, or that is not built for the way that you're used to living. So that's really interesting. And as a society, we have a lot of work to do. but especially by people with power and privilege, to undo the systems of oppression that make external leaps more accessible to everyone, not just the privileged few. I'll give myself as an example. I am somebody who lives with a disability. I have bipolar disorder. I have ADHD. And these are pretty hidden. That in that way, as a disabled person, I do have a little bit of privilege compared to someone who has a disability that you can see. So, but it is, it's a limitation when I have to disclose that sometimes. So, there are ways that, we need to look at ableism and how sometimes that is exclusive. If you're looking to start a new program of education, if you're looking to find a job, a lot of times when you disclose those things, those doors slam. And the same for, people who have names that don't sound European. So, that includes Black folks, that includes brown folks, and sometimes those resumes, when you're starting a job, they go straight in the trash. And how does that affect your ability to step into something new and create your full journey if you can't even get your foot in the door? So, that's something that's definitely worth considering when you think about reading this card, and come to it with a sense of curiosity, especially if you're reading for someone else. What does the full, taking a full leap look like for them? And I'm a big proponent of asking questions when I'm reading for someone else. Like, how do you feel about that? How does that affect you? Or what does this look like for you? And making it a collaborative effort when we're, doing readings for other people. So, if you don't normally ask questions while you're doing a reading for someone else, or you're doing a pre-recorded reading, I think it's really interesting to maybe ask your client or your querent or your friend, whoever you're reading for, what are some of the things that are more triggering, or, what intersections are you working with, so that you can make a reading as beneficial and, as relevant as possible to who you're reading for. So, that's a little bit of a digression, but I just want to say that I find that that's very helpful, because when I used to go online and look at YouTube readings, some of those things really didn't resonate with me. I know that they're for the general public, but when we're reading one-on-one, we want to try to make it as personal to the person that we're reading to as possible. So that's my soapbox. I'm going to get off of that now. So in the spring of 2020, I had the honor and the privilege to take a course called Tarot for the Wild Soul, and it's taught by Lindsay Mack. I'm pretty sure that most of my listeners have heard her name or are familiar with her work and her podcast. It was such a transformative experience, and it really cracked open a lot of the ways that I look at tarot. So Lindsay talks about that there are many ways that the Fool can be experienced on an internal level. It's a deep yes to do soul work, and that's available to all of us. So if you're ever doing a reading and you're not really sure, where your client is in their journey, that's always something that you can bring up with them. Like, what is it that your soul wants you to say yes to? And it could just be a change inside of like how they perceive themselves, how they think about themselves. There's so many ways to look at that. So, with that being said, let's talk about how we're going to look at the Fool in terms of the astrology of it. It's ruled by the planet Uranus, and just like I talked about in the introductory episode, I will be talking about the Fool in relation to the cards that are in domicile and in detriment, in exaltation, and in fall. So before I even get into talking about Uranus, let me name what those cards are. So Uranus is at home in domicile in the sign of Aquarius, and that corresponds with the star. So when we talk about the Fool, we will be talking about how those two cards relate to each other, the Fool and the star. And then we're going to move on to where it's in detriment. And Uranus is in detriment in the opposite sign. So the opposite sign of Aquarius is Leo. So when we look at the Fool, how I want to read the cards in detriment and in fall are actually in reverse. And I think that'll be really interesting. So we're going to look at the Fool and strength in reverse. And where Uranus is exalted is in the sign of Scorpio. So we'll talk about the Fool and death together. And then the sign in fall is Taurus. So that is the Hierophant, and we'll talk about the Fool and the Hierophant in reverse. So just kind of wanted to lay that groundwork of where we're going in this episode. So let's look at some keywords for the planet Uranus. Humanitarianism, reform, originality, insight, freedom, diversity, electricity. Uranus is a higher octave of the planet Mercury. So, and it literally rules the internet when you think about electricity. And we are living in the internet age. Even if we're not in the age of Aquarius yet, you can really see how we're moving towards that with all of the advances in technology. So Uranus is a planet of huge breakdowns and breakthroughs. There are things that happen that are really unexpected when Uranus is at play. Like, you really don't know what's going to happen. But it can also be really liberating. So if we look through at the Fool through the lens of its Uranian rulership, we see how when this card comes up, it's a huge invitation to make a leap, internally or externally, that can reform society, because it is a reformer. And we can do that for the better. And even if that change simply starts with us. So that's a little intro to the Fool and Uranus, being its planetary ruler. So let's talk about where Uranus is in domicile. Uranus rules the sign of Aquarius, which is in turn the ruler of the star in tarot. Because of this relationship, the underlying themes of these cards mirror each other. And that will be true for each card when we're looking at a planet and where it's in domicile. So the star is a card that deals with hope and healing and deep renewal after experiencing the oftentimes shattering experience of the Tower. It's card 17 and Tower is 16. So in the Tower, often we are shaken back to our foundation. Like, things have fallen away. Either we've cleared them out or the universe has. And there can be a lot of trauma that comes from that. And the star offers us a chance to really go back once that foundation is cleared and renew ourselves and really do some healing of trauma that we've experienced in the cards that come before it, if we're looking at it as a progression. It's card 17 out of 21, so we've experienced a lot by the time that we've gotten to the star in the major arcana. And I'm going to put in a little correction. It's 22 cards. I'm literally forgetting the Fool right now as we're talking about card 0. So let's move on. So the sign of Aquarius is associated with free-spirited, humanitarian, unique people who aren't afraid to disrupt the status quo. So when I think about the sign of Aquarius, I think of really, really original people, and whether or not they are the sun sign of Aquarius, they have a lot of those unique qualities. So at the time of this recording, it's almost Super Bowl Sunday, and the artist The Weeknd is doing the halftime show. I believe The Weeknd is an Aquarius. He's either that or like he's right on the cusp and he's a Pisces, but his style is so unique. And I think of David Bowie. David Bowie was a Capricorn, but he was very Aquarian. I mean, if you think about, the ways that he really took on different styles and reinvented himself, and he even, took on the persona of Ziggy Stardust. And I'm thinking about the song Starman, which is one of my absolute favorites, but that's just one example of, an Aquarius archetype really being eccentric and being fully themselves and not being afraid to, do something that is totally different from what the mainstream is doing. In the beginning of MTV, he really, channeled that Aquarian sense of, rebellion and really breaking down barriers, because he challenged one of the VJs at MTV and asked him, why don't you play music and music videos by Black artists? Like, what's going on with that? And, he really kept pressing him in the way that, he kind of just sat back and let this guy completely look foolish. That's a very interesting correlation, but that he really twisted himself in a pretzel trying to explain how this, people in the Midwest wouldn't really relate to it. And I mean, look at artists like Michael Jackson and Prince. At that time they were huge and they're from the Midwest themselves. So, but his ability to, channel that like need for, diversity, and he wasn't afraid to go out and take a stand and say like, this may be the way that you do things, but it's not right. So, and he said it without saying a lot, and he did it very unapologetically. So that's a really good example of the Fool and the Star working together, is that he wielded his power and he could have stayed silent, but he challenged authority and the quote-unquote tastemakers and challenged the status quo to affect change in the future. So I think, that's an excellent example of how when the Star and the Fool work together, that we can challenge things within ourselves or outside of ourselves to really affect change that, will create a brighter future for the collective. At its core, we can see how the relationship between these cards is all about shaking things up, being unapologetically ourselves, which can be really triggering for marginalized folks. I mean, if you think about systems that tell you that you're not valuable, and then you're conditioned to undervalue yourself, what does it mean to practice self-care and healing? Everyone is deserving of that. So it can really be healing on a personal and a collective level. When we do deep soul work that allows us to be fully embodied and present, we give permission to others to do the same. We become trailblazers in our families, in our friend circles, in our larger communities, and it ripples outward on and on. If you think about it, millennials, Gen Z, and the generations that are coming after us really have been trailblazers in openly talking about trauma and healing ancestral wounds, and, where it might have been something that was more esoteric or underground, it's really become a part of the collective conversation in a way that it hadn't been before. Two other artists I want to mention are Grace Jones and Tina Turner. But I know I can't talk about everything or this would get way too long. So let's move forward and talk about where Uranus is in its detriment and how that relates to the Fool and strength in reverse. So Uranus is in detriment in the sign of Leo, and that is ruled by the Strength card. So we're going to look at strength in the reverse. And that doesn't always mean that when a card is in reverse that it carries some kind of negative connotation. It honestly, to me, I think that when there is a planet in detriment, and I have a few of them in my birth chart, so I can speak from personal experience, that it really is an opportunity to, through those challenges, it gives us such an opportunity for growth. So I never want to say that, like, if you pull a reversal or if you have a planet that's in detriment in your chart, that that's a, quotes, bad thing, because I don't like thinking about good, bad binaries anyway, like that. It's very overly simplistic, but let's move forward. So let's talk about strength in reverse and how we can use the Fool as a kind of tool to work with this energy. Strength deals with themes of leading with the heart and being vulnerable. That those are things that Leo does really well. What happens when that fierce, brave Leo energy gets turned on its head? When we look at the Strength card in reverse, it can indicate an unwillingness or a resistance or fear of being vulnerable. I think it's safe to say that at one point or another in all of our lives, we've been in a place where opening up feels unsafe. And allowing ourselves to be seen can be really scary. And often for legitimate reasons. Society as a whole doesn't value what vulnerable strength looks like. If you think about it, when someone says, talks about strength, they're often talking about that hyper masculine, toxic masculinity of like, oh, I'm not afraid to get in someone's face, or, having to be strong by holding things in, which really turns into toxicity within ourselves. And I think as a society, it makes us all sicker, because if we're thinking about what I was talking about with strength, with the Star and the Fool, and how we can show up and be unapologetically ourselves. What happens when we feel like we have to hide who we are because we don't feel safe sharing, and, people will mock us or, kill us? Look at, how many trans folks are killed every year, just simply for being themselves, or, the issues with racism and how, Black folks don't feel safe with the police. That's the impetus for the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Like, that's not something that you can hide. Your race is out there, for everyone to see. But, in certain spaces, it can feel really unsafe to be unapologetically yourself. And I think that's one way that we can look at strength in reverse. Another way we can look at strength in reverse is from the other side of the spectrum of the people who hate, and what that says about their level of vulnerability and their ability to show up and allow themselves to be seen. Because honestly, the way that I look at it is that we project onto people the things that we hate about ourselves. And it doesn't have to be the same thing that you're seeing. Like, I would never suggest that someone who's homophobic is secretly gay. Like, that, that does happen, but that's not, what I am implying here. What I'm saying is that there can be something that is blocked in their own heart space, their own traumas that they haven't dealt with in their lives that could be completely unrelated, but that there has to be a part of someone who fears or hates a certain community. There has to be a part of them that is cut off from their own heart space in order to, really take actionable steps to demonstrate that hate or to not work on that. Like, they live from a place of fear rather than love, and they have their own Fool work to do, and their own star work to do to really get in touch with their heart. So when we look at strength in reverse, the Fool really says, take a leap in saying yes to yourself. Like, how can I change? How can I really shake things up that, changes my life for the better? Or how can I take that leap into vulnerability where I may not have felt safe before? And part of that could be looking for community. Aquarius is, big, the sign of the collective. So how can I find a place, that makes me feel accepted for who I am, and then allow myself to be seen? So that's how I relate those two. So, if you ever pull strength in reverse in a reading, for yourself or for a client, just think, what is preventing me from showing up and allowing myself to, be seen for who I am, to unapologetically be myself. And, looking at the star, are there any ways that I need to do healing around that, or is there anyone that I can reach out to that can aid me in that healing? Or can I be part of healing the collective and showing people that it's okay to be vulnerable? So that is how I am looking at the Fool and its relationship to Leo being the sign that Uranus is in detriment. So the strength in reverse really is asking us to do some Fool work. So now we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back to talk about death and the Hierophant in reverse. Don't go away. Are you looking for a foundational course in tarot that's free and readily available? I'd like to introduce you to a podcast called Rootlock Radio, hosted by my friend and mentor, Weston. The entire first season lays a great foundation for anyone who is new to tarot, or even if you're a seasoned tarot reader. He's a whiz at establishing systems that make tarot practical and accessible. If you're already a Rootlock Radio listener, you know exactly what I mean. If not, what are you waiting for? Go subscribe to his podcast and learn from one of the best tarot readers I know. The link for Weston's podcast and Instagram are in the show notes, so go check it out now. And now we're going to move on to where Uranus is exalted. So Uranus is exalted in the sign of Scorpio. And Scorpio is ruled by, the death card is ruled by Scorpio in the major arcana. So a planet in its exaltation is really where it excels. And instantly looking at these two cards, I can really see why. So the Fool is really stepping out of fear and living unapologetically. And a lot of times when we do that, there are a lot of old ways of being that really have to be offered up, to the fire. And as Lindsay Mack says, put on the compost heap of our lives. And Scorpio being the sign of death and rebirth and transformation, they really have an ability to dig into that work, to go deep, and really excavate, what is, my trauma, because Scorpio rules the 8th house, and that is the house of, death and also shared resources. So, I mean, it really is the house of intimacy as well. So looking at strength in reverse, where, we can have fear of intimacy, Scorpio is like, let's connect on a deep soul level. Like, we are not going to have surface conversations. We're really going to look at our trauma and where can we heal. So it makes total sense to me why Uranus would be exalted in Scorpio, and how, if we're looking at the Fool and the Death card, especially if these cards come up together, it's really asking you to transform your pain into purpose. And in no way am I romanticizing trauma. It's really hard to do healing work. But if the Death card, if there is advice that the Fool has, it is that, any leap that you take, even if it's internal, to transform something about yourself, that you're really going to change your life for the better. So that is, that's exaltation. Like, that is, and maybe when these cards come out, you want to look for someone who has that very scorpionic energy, and that could mean going to therapy. A lot of Scorpios, or anyone who has a really strong Scorpio signature in their chart, they're really good at getting to the core of, what's going on inside of a person, even if they don't mean to. Like, they're natural diggers and excavators, and, they are not afraid to go to those dark, scary places. So, your Fool journey could be seeking out someone who has done their healing work, their own Fool work, and asking them, can you help me? Because they've paved the way, they've trailblazed, so, they can help you do the same in your life. And those transformations, honestly, you will never be the same once you've really done full death work. So that is how we can look in tarot terms, tarot astrology terms, if you will, how the Fool is exalted in the Death card. So the Fool is doing transformational work, taking that leap. So now we're going to move on and talk about the Fool in its fall. And that is in the opposite sign of Scorpio, in Taurus. And I think this is really interesting to talk about right now, because Uranus is currently in the sign of Taurus. And Taurus is ruled by the Hierophant. And we're also in a Hierophant year in 2021. So this gives us a real opportunity right now to look at where we are and how we can work with these energies. So when I look at the Hierophant, in this context, I am going to talk about institutions. And that is a really big theme right now, especially if you're living in the US. Our institutions are really at a make or break moment. The last time that Uranus was in the sign of Taurus was during the Great Depression. Like, that was something that happened. And also that was the same time that the New Deal was passed, the first and the second New Deal. And I think astrology is so interesting because of how these cycles work, and how things change, but how they still remain the same in certain ways. So, Uranus was in the sign of Taurus, but there were a lot of other planets doing really different things. And Uranus is in Taurus again, but we have a lot of planets right now in the sign of Aquarius. So, when we think about how, this pandemic and, the years leading up to it with the Trump administration, and the Republicans, I am not a Republican, and, if politics make you uncomfortable, this may not be the podcast for you, because I'm definitely going to talk about it from my perspective, but the ways that they have really gutted institutions that are meant to serve the collective and serve the most vulnerable people. They've really shown how big business and those corporations are really what they hold, what they value. And Taurus is all about values. It rules the second house, and that is our possessions, our belongings. But, the motto for Taurus is I have. So what do they think that the people who are most vulnerable in our society, what do they deserve to have? Do they deserve to have security, financial security during this time where so many people are losing their homes, losing their jobs, that, $2,000, we have to argue about that, and we have to do means testing, and, just the ways that, they, like, what do institutions value, and can we count on our institutions to show up for everyone and benefit everyone, or is it going to benefit the few that are already well off and well to do? So when we think about the Fool, and we think about Uranus and Taurus, this is a time where, even though Taurus is the sign where Uranus is in fall, we have a chance to really overturn these systems. And by doing Fool work, that means saying, yes, we're worth it, and making our voices heard. Because in the Obama years, and I'm going to say times before that, where it was easy to kind of put our trust in the government. I mean, not in every single way. I never want to, completely blanket say that there were no problems with the Obama administration. There were plenty. But a lot of folks, they got woken up by Trump winning the presidency, where they were asleep, and they didn't see a lot of, the ways that we were just giving our power away and taking for granted that these institutions were always going to be there and something that we don't have to fight for and protect. And, now we're seeing how fragile democracy is as an institution, and how easy it is for the wrong people to infiltrate our government and completely gut it from the inside. And the people who suffer the most are the people who have more intersections of marginalization. And that is really key to looking at how the Fool and the Hierophant in reverse work together. So I just thought that was an interesting way to, that little tidbit, because one thing that has been talked about more recently, where in the Trump administration, the Green New Deal, it was not a possibility. Now we're talking about it again. And it may be like the Affordable Care Act, where we may not get everything that we want out of it right away, but the fact that there's even a conversation about some of these things being possible, that's a big deal. So a planet being in its fall doesn't necessarily mean that there are, that it's a bad thing. There's a lot of suffering that's happening right now, but there is a big opportunity to really shake things up where they will never be like they were before. That we really can pass Medicare for all now. Where it didn't look like it was a possibility before. People are really opening their eyes to the ways that, healthcare has not served us well in America. How our systems are really, really broken. And sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to really see how bad things are and how much needs to change. So those are the ways that I am conceptualizing, looking at these cards through an astrological lens. And I hope that this conversation, that this lesson was beneficial to you, that you learned something new from it. And that is our lesson on the Fool. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with a listener question. So don't go anywhere. So my loves, it's time for our listener segment, and we did get a write-in from someone, and I'm so excited to do this reading, but I want to give a little bit of a content warning before we get started. This listener's question deals with fertility issues and wounding around that. So if you have any sensitivities or you feel like you're not open and available for that right now, check in with yourself and see if, there might be a better time for you to come back and listen to that segment, or maybe you don't want to listen to it at all. But I just wanted to go ahead and give that content warning before we dive in. Okay, so our question comes from Stevie. Hi, Stevie. And Stevie is from London. Her sun, moon, and rising she is a Scorpio sun, Aquarius rising, and a Capricorn moon. Hello, my fellow Capricorn moon. I love that placement. So Stevie's, the subject of Stevie's reading is having Chiron in the 5th house in Gemini and how that interacts with fertility. And I'll read her message. She says, "Hello, I've been trying to conceive for 2 years. I've been told that I have no medical issues and have been diagnosed with unexplained infertility and referred for IVF. What is the interaction, if any, with this placement in my chart? Chiron in the 5th. What is the energy surrounding this situation? Is there something that I'm missing or should be looking towards? And as an aside, she says, FYI, I lost my father suddenly in mid-2020. I'm so sorry about that, which has been hard, but I'm in counseling. If anything around that comes up, let me know." So thank you. And thank you for Stevie for writing in and sharing such a vulnerable topic. And I pulled some cards for you, and let's just jump in. I feel like they were very, very aligned, especially for the conversation that we had in the first segment in the show around the Fool. Because your first placement, I asked, what is the overall energy surrounding this situation? And I pulled the Fool for you. So that is doing that full work of diving into working on your trauma and if you have any, and triggers, and really healing around, something that is, can be very painful. I've dealt with fertility issues myself, and I know how isolating that can feel, how lonely it can feel, how frustrating that it can feel. And the Fool really is a beautiful energy that just allows you to kind of step into that work. And I know you said that you're doing therapy, and that is a really, really big step. And I want to validate that for you, how much that can really contribute to your healing. So Chiron in the 5th, I'm not a medical astrologer. I will go ahead and, preface this, and I'm not a medical professional, but I did do a little bit of research before I pulled your cards. And Chiron in the 5th house, since the 5th house rules children, and it can rule fertility, it does indicate, issues with fertility. So, I just want to validate that for you, that, that is a key there that you may want to look into, if there are no medical issues, that maybe going to an astrologer who specializes in medical astrology would be a good leap to take. Kind of like when we talked about in the first segment that Uranus and Scorpio, Scorpio can be really associated with the mystical, and seeing someone who has that medical piece but also knows about astrology might be something that's really, really valuable for you. So your next card is what's underlying this situation. And what we got is the 5 of Cups. And I know that you mentioned that your father passed away, and I'm so sorry. That is, a pain that I can't even imagine. But the 5 of Cups deals with being able to take time to look at your grief, like openly grieve. This is a card that's also related to Scorpio. So, not being afraid to really look at those cups and, what's spilled over, in those cups that are knocked over, and we can feel shattered, we can feel, broken inside, and that all of those feelings are okay. Like whatever comes up for you is okay. And to be able to acknowledge that and really name the different levels of grief and the different types of grief that you're experiencing can be really powerful. Which leads me to your next card is, how can I support myself around this wounding? And I'm reading with the Spacious Tarot. So the pages are called the Children. And you got the Child of Swords in reverse. So when I think about the Page of Swords in the reverse, that this is really about rooting down, and channeling that pain that's in the 5 of Cups, so that we can make that leap, with the Fool. Because it's all about making that leap into, learning how to use your voice in a way that's powerful and that's healing. And I'm so glad that you are in therapy and you're embracing that, especially around the grief with your father. But there is a subject that's not discussed as much, or that I don't really see much conversation being had around, and it's called complicated grief. Like, we can grieve over many things, whether or not, someone has died, and being someone who is going through fertility issues, there is a lot of grieving to be done around what you may feel like, is being taken from you, or what you feel like, the years that you've lost where you may have wanted to have a child and, life goes on and you see other people with children. There are so many ways that can be experienced, and it's all okay. So I think, with that Child of Swords being in the reverse, it's really saying, like, don't resist naming it, really speaking it, because the swords are a suit of communication, and it's also about the way that we think. And sometimes we can think, especially when I see the 5 of Cups come up, that we are all alone on an island, and, we can feel really closed off. And, there are times that, no judgment, that is all okay. whatever happens, I think that the reversal of this card is really just saying, like, don't resist when you have those feelings to connect with someone, to talk about it, to channel your truth, to really, really step into that. So that leads to your next card, which is, how can I release? Or, what do I need to release? And you got another page. You got the Page of Wands in reverse. So a really important release for you right now would be to find some way that you can utilize your energy. And that could be body work, that could be movement, but it's really something that, I'm thinking right now about how you're inquiring about the 5th house. And, that's related to Leo, and Leo is our creativity, and how, like, rooting down into a creative project or something that just really makes you feel like you come alive is going to be so important for you on this journey. So never neglect that part, of yourself, that you're really going to want to find ways to, to dance or sing or whatever it is that brings you that sense of pure childlike joy. That can be a really, really important tool for you. And your final card is your Oracle card. And what I pulled for you is Transmute. And that's so interesting to me because transmutation is just it's almost like turning our pain into our passion, or, turning our pain into something that we can help others with, which is, it's a big thing that we talked about with the Fool earlier in the first segment of this episode. Is like, how can we do our processing and change it into something that can benefit the collective? So Chiron is often called the wounded healer, and that's because when we do our Chiron work, and we all have Chiron wounds, that we can in turn help others with their wounds because we understand what it feels like to struggle, and to have places where, we're really raw and we've done that healing. So, that transmutation might, be connecting with a support group. And, if you really hit it off with someone and they've done their full work, or you're working on your full work, it's a way, that you can really channel that into benefiting the lives of other people. So if that makes sense. But that's what I'm getting from this spread for you. And again, I just really want to honor what you're going through, and to say that, you're, whatever way you feel about yourself right now, like, you're brave for just being here, for, getting through it, and also, for reaching out in this way. So I wish you the best of luck. And if you'd like to shoot me an email and let me know if this resonates at all, feel free to at any time. My email address is venusinretrocast@gmail.com. And take care, Stevie. I also want to add that on the Instagram post for today's episode, there is a picture of the cards and a copy of the spread that I used. So if any of the listeners, or Stevie, if you want to see your cards, make sure that you're following me on Instagram and that you go to that post and you can swipe through and see everything that I did. So that's it for today's episode on the Fool and our first collective reading. And if you would like to submit a question or comment, make sure that you fill out the form that's in the show notes, or it's linked in my link tree on Instagram. And I look so forward to hearing from all of you. And I hope that you have a good week. Bye. Thanks for joining me this week on Venus and Retrocast. Make sure to visit my Instagram page at Venus and Retro Tarot for more amazing content. I post tarot spreads, collective readings, and connect with all of you. Make sure to subscribe on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. If you found value in the show, I'd greatly appreciate a rating on iTunes, or tell a friend about the show. Any way you choose to support the podcast, I'm so grateful that you're here.